Hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez, and we're coming to you today from a different location, the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation. Oh, if these walls could talk. This is such a special experience, I think, for me as an American journalist, to be able to share with what are, in many ways, a Western audience, a better understanding of the Russia perspective. And especially coming from this place, with the history of this place, the majesty of this place. You walk the halls of this building and just the names, the images. You see Trotsky, Gromyko, Shevardnadze, the people who we grew up watching, creating this story that is what Russia is today, as a matter of fact. So it is an absolute honor for me to be able to bring this story from this location and to be in the presence of the man who many consider to be the voice of the Russian Federation, certainly from a global perspective, the Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, the Minister of the Russian Federation, Mr. Sergei Lavrov. Mr. Lavrov, thank you so much for joining us, sir. It is such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I guess we have to start with some of the things that are going on right now. And I think probably the most important thing has to be taking place in Europe. And let me ask you this, because I was kind of taken aback when I saw this. Recently, the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, said that Russia is the largest country in all of Europe. And then he went on to make it sound as if he's inviting Russia to be back of the European community. But this is the same man who just recently seemed to almost be wanting to go to war with Russia. What did you make of his comments?
Well, right now, many European politicians over the last 4 or 6 weeks have been talking about relations with the Russian Federation. Until recently, they were absolutely adamant in their requirements to continue supporting Ukraine, to continue supplying weapons to Ukraine, to continue to finance Ukraine, to deliver a strategic defeat on the battlefield to the Russian Federation. Then their rhetoric changed when they realized that it was all just castles in the air, and that their military planners, their military analysts who had been preparing this operation, who had been preparing Ukrainians to push the war with Ukraine with their hands and bodies, when they realized that all those plans had failed, and nobody obviously had managed to take lessons from previous developments, such as Napoleon's attempt, such as Hitler's attempt, and once again they used Nazi banners to gather almost entire Europe. But unlike Napoleon and Hitler, not on the battleground, but they gathered Europe as donors of financing and armaments and ideology, and under the same Nazi banners they threw the Ukrainian army, complete with mercenaries from different countries and NATO military instructors, we know that. And basically, they did another attempt that ended up much like Napoleon's and Hitler's attempts did. But the West is very bad at learning history, obviously, especially Germany, that you mentioned, because after several relatively calm years under Angela Merkel, and there was this vague period of Scholz being the chancellor. When Merz became chancellor, they started off with very striking statements. For example, he said, well, first of all, he lifted constitutional limitations on military spending, and then he said that it is all needed for Germany to again, I emphasize again, become the primary military power in Europe. This is well, this seriously reflects his mentality and the direction in which his thoughts are going. After that, Merz many times repeated this thought in many forms, and practically what he has been doing is basically a war preparation. The same was happening in France, where President Macron repeatedly said that Ukraine cannot lose on the battlefield. I'm not even talking about the British with their Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen and Mark Rutte. Yes, recently Merz said something along the lines of Russia being the biggest country in Europe, but I'd like to correct him right away. Russia is the biggest country in Eurasia, not in Europe, and in the world. But in this case, we're looking at Eurasia as a continent. All previous attempts to ensure security on this vast expanse were exclusively about the western part of Eurasia, the so-called Europe, and all attempts at building a security system were centered around the Euro-Atlantic concept of security. The NATO the Americans didn't want to leave Europe to their own devices, and even now they want Europeans to pay for all their military preparations. But at the same time, the Americans didn't want to lose oversight and control over their European allies. Then there was the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, another organization that symbolized a move from Cold War to peaceful coexistence. Equal rights, consensus, everything was supposed to be done on equitable basis. But the fact that OSCE has completely discredited itself, I don't even have to talk about that. It's obvious for everyone. And during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, those who were talking about the need to close NATO as well, there were talks about replacing NATO and the Warsaw Pact with OSCE as a collective structure, as a new bloc based on an honest and equal partnership and balance of interests. Back then, they failed at that bitterly, because neither the US, neither the UK, or any other leading country didn't want to disband NATO. On the opposite, as Francis Fukuyama stated, they wanted the end of history. And now the end of history is all about liberal ideology, democracy, the way the West sees it, NATO as a guarantor of security everywhere, and they wanted to dominate the globe. This psychology, this rhetoric led to what we have today. But as the Euro-Atlantic structures are getting weaker and the European Union is now just an appendix to NATO, this is obvious for everyone who can see. Along with those processes, Germany has started to rear its head again. And this is worrying. This worries not only us, but it worries many other countries of the European Union who are feeling more and more, well, who resist to Germany's desire to suppress everyone. And Merz openly ties this revival of Germany with its militarization, with its preparation for a war. They have a defense minister, Pistorius, his name is. I guess I got all the letters right, hopefully. And Pistorius still says that year 2029, 2030 is the year when we have to be ready to wage war against the Russian Federation. I don't know who he is trying to convince that Russia is willing to wage a war. It's enough to know history to rule out any such stupid guesses. But even if we take the arguments that we have been hearing from them, Russia is getting weak, Russia is barely advancing along the Ukrainian soil, Russia takes inches of that land a day, Russia is failing bitterly, they're saying. The 5th year of the war, huge casualties that Russia is forced to overcome great difficulties. And while presenting their voters with a picture of militarily weak Russia or economically weak Russia, they at the same time draw a link to the fact that we must prepare that Russia is going to attack us, meaning Europe. But if you depict Russia as a militarily and economically weak country, then have just, some imagination to cheat your voters in such a blatant way. The talks you have been mentioning, and Macron, about 2 weeks ago, said once again that he's going to call President Putin someday. Well, this is not serious. This is ridiculous. If you want to make a call, just do it. Putin will always pick up the phone. He will always listen to any propositions. And if we're talking serious propositions, then I dare assure you they will not be left without serious contemplation and reaction. We have contacts, I make no secrets of that. We have contacts with some of the European leaders. They call us. Some of them even appear here in Moscow, in Russia. But in such confidential talks with our European partners, nothing that they have informed us, nothing is different from what they have been saying publicly. It's the same, all the same. It's the same calls. Let's end it. We have to do something about it. I don't see a position in Europe. I think they're trapped in their own trap. They have taken an uncompromising stance, going back to where I started. Strategic defeat to Russia. Ukraine cannot lose. Russia cannot win. Otherwise, Europe will lose face. And everything they've been doing now is about undermining the talks that are shaping up between us and the Americans, and currently Ukraine is joining them.
It almost sounds like you're saying we have been burned so many times that we have a hard time right now with trust. When you consider the fact that in the early 90s, Russia did everything possible to align itself with the United States, with the West, that Mr. Putin and yourself have talked about even joining NATO. And now it seems that even though I talk to the Russian people since I've been reporting here, I don't feel a sense of antagonism against Europe from Russians, but I feel a sense of antagonism from Europe against the Russians, right? The Russians don't feel antagonistic against Europe, but the Europeans feel antagonistic against the Russians. What are you at the point now where the position of Russia is, we've been burned so many times, we have been deceived so many times, we're just not willing to come to the table, at least not on your terms. We have to set the terms. Is that kind of where you are right now?
Yes, largely yes. The most important thing you said right now, we obviously, yes, have been burned many times. We have been deceived. Our trust has been deceived. Our trust to people who once swore that there will be no expansion of NATO to the east, that there will be no infringement of Russia's interests, that there will be a single territory from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and this huge continent was promised to be a continent of peace and security. We created the Russian-NATO Council with them, in our commitment to establish an ongoing dialogue and increase trust within that Russia-NATO Council. We wanted to present information on our respective armed forces. There were lots of interesting things going on there regarding transparency. But at the same time, NATO, when it's lost its basically point of existence, then they regained it in Afghanistan, and then that point of existence was trampled publicly in Afghanistan in front of the entire global community. And back then they braced themselves, and then they came up with what we are seeing now, that Russia is going to be an outcast, and to provoke Russia, Ukraine was the best material for that. Very malleable, especially that they had been mulling this material since the USSR had collapsed. And all those promises not to expand NATO, to stay out of direct vicinity of the Russian Federation, all this was thrown aside, and they've been dallying with Ukraine since 1990s, spending billions of dollars. And Victoria Nuland recently admitted that preparation for the February 2014 coup had costed $5 billion. And I'm sure that some of the expenditures for Ukraine is several times more. Ukraine became independent on the basis of its declaration, which said that Ukraine will forever remain neutral, nuclear-free, and non-bloc country. And back in 1991, when acknowledging the independence of Ukraine, we acknowledged it on these exact terms. We acknowledged a state like this, free of blocs, free of nukes, and neutral. So right now, our conscience is clear. Everybody recognized Ukraine like this, including the West. And then the West started making this country into what they thought they needed, not what was put forward in the Declaration of Independence.
Do you tell them that? When, obviously, I don't want you to share the specifics of your conversations with other foreign ministers and other heads of state in Europe and in the United States, but do you say to them, look, all we want is a neutral Ukraine. They don't have to be pro-Russian. They don't have to be pro-anything. We just want a neutral Ukraine. We want to be respected. And by the way, we have no intention of bombing you. We have no intention of going to war with Russia. We have no intention of going with Europe. We have no intentions of going to war, period, which is what they keep telling the world. They say Russia is very aggressive. And Russia is saying, we're not aggressive.
Well, they do tell a lot to the world community. Quite recently, they said that no one of them had been to the Epstein Island. That's just their style. Of course, we told them that, all of that. More than that, we gave them countless facts of our very restrained position and restrained behavior. Although there were situations when this restraint was seen as weakness by many people in our country. The first Maidan, the first state coup in Ukraine, took place in 2004 when Kuchma was president. And President Putin had great ties with President Kuchma. They discussed all matters frankly. And I was there when they had a telephone conversation in President Putin's office, when his Ukrainian counterpart called him and said that the West had rallied thousands of people to the Independence Square in Kiev. There were tents and banners were waved, and they were refusing to recognize the results of presidential election. And he asked President Putin, what do I do? Kuchma said, they have weapons, they are armed, and what do I do? And President Putin answered, President Kuchma, you are a president. If law is being violated, if law is being breached, you have the constitution, And you have the parliament-approved schemes of combating, well, law violations. President Kuchma didn't want to use force. He didn't want to defend law, and the Constitutional Court assigned the third round of presidential election that was not provided for in any constitution or in any other document. So it was a violation of the law. Just because the West had financed that Maidan, that was my first year as the foreign minister of the Russian Federation. And back then, many foreign ministers, European foreign ministers, said publicly that the Ukrainians must choose whether they are with Russia or they are with Europe. That was their position back then. They didn't talk about any single space from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. It's either or, whether they are with Russia or they are with Europe. That was their stance. This was a gross violation of the law. It was a coup, basically. But still, we chose to work with the president essentially appointed by the West after that third tour, Viktor Yushchenko. And he was absolutely pro-West. He had an American wife who made no secret of her citizenship and her allegiance, and whose interests she was pushing forward as the First Lady of Ukraine. But still, we worked with them, we traded gas with them, and we signed agreements with the then Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, although those people were absolutely pro-West. But still, we were ready to work with them. We were ready to work with people who had orchestrated another coup in 2014. Back then, an agreement was signed between President Yanukovych and the authors of the coup, the junta, basically. The urgent election was to take place, and an interim government was to work. The West guaranteed that France, Germany, Poland, and Obama called Putin back then, saying, "Vladimir, please don't talk Yanukovych out of signing this treaty." And he said, if I see a legitimate president who is trying to calm down and stabilize his country, how can I be against that? That's what President Putin said. And when one day after signing that treaty, another coup took place, we asked the Americans, how come? You asked us to uphold this signing. We did what you asked us. And you immediately sent people to take government buildings, armed people to take government buildings. The Germans and the French, who had guaranteed this treaty, they just, well, were hiding their eyes and told us, well, sometimes democracy takes surprising curves. And after that, when this new group that took over the power, the first things they did was to cancel the official status of Russian language, and the second thing they did, they sent armed people to storm the government of Crimea, because Crimea refused to have any business with them, saying that they are illegitimate. And the people in the Crimea were called terrorists, although they didn't shoot at anyone. They were just asking to leave them alone. And then they started using combat aircraft and artillery against their own territories, which is against the international law. And when all this started, Fogh Rasmussen, the then Secretary General of NATO, who had repeatedly called upon President Yanukovych not to use army against his people. And after the coup, Rasmussen immediately called upon the junta to use proportional force against those who didn't accept that coup. And throughout the entire history, the West counts the history from March 2014, when Crimea held a referendum on reuniting with Russia. So in the West's history and practical policy, this is where it all started. Everything had been well, but then the Russians came, held the referendum, and from that on, things went south. This was when we disappointed in the West's inability to deliver on their promises. And 1 year later, after lengthy hostilities, the Minsk agreements, Merkel, Hollande, Putin, Poroshenko, they spent a whole night, 17 hours of work. And they signed the agreements, had them approved at the UN Security Council, and then Ukraine just didn't obey that. Just right as it is now. During the special military operation, Zelensky disrupted all peace attempts. And when several years later Merkel and Hollande admitted that the Minsk agreements were only needed to win time for Ukraine, to win time to arm Ukraine, well, as they say, Russians took quite a while to prepare. But once they are ready, they do act very fast. And we wanted to trust the situation that developed 2 weeks after the start of the special military operation in April 2022 in Istanbul during the negotiations. We agreed to what the Ukrainians had proposed, and then Boris Johnson came there and basically banned them, the Ukrainians, from following it, from following through. So we have quite an experience of, well, not in enduring or... We have quite an experience of, quite a history of understanding this situation. And we see that this experience has taught nothing to our European colleagues. That's obvious.
That's an important story that you just shared, because you just took us through an explanation of what was deceitful, planned, a coup, and, as many now understand, a provocation on the part of the West. But in the West, the only story that often people hear is Russia bullied its way into Ukraine. Russia was the aggressor. And it's important, sir, that, and I know you're adamant and passionate about often telling that story, because we mention, you know, the story of the big story that's taking place in the United States right now. I'm just wondering as well, you know, in the case of what's happening in America right now, what is the nature of some of these people who did this in that moment? And are they the same people or comparable to the people who are caught up in this Epstein situation now? That kind of individual who have, unfortunately, in many ways, been making decisions, geopolitical decisions about the world? Is there a, I guess...
You mean people in Ukraine?
No, I mean people in Ukraine, in the United States, in Europe, all over the place. The type of people we're learning now who were involved in this horrible Epstein thing. These people who were deceitful, somewhat decrepit. Is this the same kind of person who have led to what happened in Ukraine, to the coup in Ukraine, to the deceit in Ukraine? Would you say that that's the same kind of person? Or maybe even some of the exact people?
I think regarding the specific persons, specific personalities, we can't probably make generalizations like that, but the fact, what we call the deep state, what is known as the hidden funds or closed groups, and they are said to be able to decide the fates of the world. Well, I don't quite believe in that, because people who are elected presidents or prime ministers, they have enough leverage to pursue their own course. And if they all pursue a course that is all about deceiving, that is all about being unable to feel shame or to blush for openly lying to their partners, well, that's a fact. There are plenty of such people there, and right now I think this mentality is showing very visibly on the European arena. And they haven't been making any conclusions, obviously. They haven't taken any lessons. Today is February the 4th. Another round of military negotiations is opening between Russia and Ukraine. And it will also be attended by representatives of the United States, Witkoff, Kushner. And just yesterday, exactly on the eve of that day, not somewhere in the Great Britain, in the UK, in Financial Times, no less, there's a report that says the Russians will be given nothing short of an ultimatum, a document with the guarantee securities for Ukraine that have already been approved. And security guarantees for Ukraine basically mean that if Russia ever dares to attack Ukraine again, or if we, the smart guys, organize some sort of provocation that will allow to accuse Russia, then in 24 hours we will give Ukraine carte blanche to continue the war. In 48 hours we will gather everybody willing to fight Russia, and 72 hours later we will be joined by the U.S. in that. That's delirious. But this delirium is quite telltale. What it shows that over the last year, the West, I mean Europe, have been saying only one thing: we need reliable guarantees of security for Ukraine, immediate ceasefire and guarantees of security for Ukraine. But we have been asking, what about the root causes of the conflict? Without eliminating them, these security guarantees will only mean that the ceasefire will be used to pump more weapons into Ukraine. They remained oblivious to that logic. But right now, the Trump administration, when they got down to the Ukrainian case, by the way, we see what the Trump administration has been doing in relation to the Russian Federation. We see that with caution. We are very wary about that, but a couple words on that later. The Trump administration, I will tell you about that later. Right now, I'd like to talk about security guarantees for Ukraine. The Trump administration said right away that they want to get down to the root causes of the conflict. And President Trump said publicly that Ukraine should forget about NATO. And President Trump, with his team, started talking that the situation on the ground must be taken into account when dealing with this. And all this was discussed in Anchorage, Alaska. And once again, we explained to our American counterparts that it's not about the territory, it's not so much about the land, it's about the people who lived in these territories. Their ancestors had lived there for centuries. These lands were Russian people lived there, who brought up their children in Russian, with Russian language. And these people, in Crimea, in Donbass, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye regions, these people were called non-humans by the new regime in Ukraine. And the then President Poroshenko said openly that our Ukrainian children will go to kindergartens and schools, and the people of those in Donbass, the people of those terrorists in Donbass, as he put it, they will rot underground, they will rot in cellars. And Zelensky, long before the special military operation, when answering a question what he thinks about people on the other side of the battle line, Zelensky said, there are people and there are species. And if you live in Ukraine and you feel part of Russian culture or Russian civilization, my advice is for the future of your people and grandchildren, go to Russia. Get the hell out to Russia. That's what he said. And this is what underlines the attitude of the current Kiev regime to all things Russian. And from 2019, this regime has passed a dozen, probably, laws banning Russian education, Russian culture, Russian media, and basically all things Russian, and banning the canonic Russian Orthodox Church. And these laws legalized the theory and practice of Nazism, basically, including erecting monuments to those who were considered Nazi criminals and those who were condemned at the Nuremberg trial. And when they keep talking about security guarantees, I have one simple question. Security guarantees to what state are we talking about? I mean, this state, where Russian language is banned, the only country in the world, by the way, to ban Russian language, officially ban. Israel never banned Arab language. Palestine never banned Hebrew. And Ukraine is the only state to ban a language of a native people. And if they want security guarantees to enshrine this regime, of course, this is unacceptable. This is inadmissible. And if they try to trade some concessions, the Russian language, this will be unfair, because language freedoms, religious freedoms are written down in the UN Charter, and they can't be a matter of bargaining. Ukraine is a member of United Nations, so please be so kind to stick to the UN Charter. It says in the Ukrainian Constitution that the state respects the rights of Russian and other national minorities. So when this topic is omitted in the West, and they're talking about security guarantees for Zelensky, then it's Zelensky's that they want to preserve and his Nazi regime. Well, this is bad. And now going back to our contacts with the Americans and the 28-point document that we were given. It said about the need to restore the rights of national minorities and the religious freedoms. And in the last iteration of the document that we haven't seen, but that Zelensky has been talking about 20 entries, it doesn't say anything anymore about restoring the rights of Russians and other minorities. This document only says that Ukraine will show tolerance in accordance with the norms of the European Union. Why so? There are norms that go beyond, well, the European geography. And there are norms in the European Union that are unacceptable to many countries.
Because things are so difficult right now in Ukraine, the problems they're having with their energy grid, for example. Yesterday, several officials, including a regional governor of Ukraine, told Mr. Zelensky publicly, let's do this deal, sign where we are right now for the good of the people of Ukraine, give up the territories that you are arguing about, and you need to do that for the good of the people of Ukraine. We're hearing this now from people in Ukraine who are saying this. That's really important. If somehow Mr. Zelensky can be talked into ceding that territory and giving Russia the security guarantees that it needs, i.e. no European troops in Ukraine, and the respect of the Russian heritage and religion, is that something that Russia can then live with and sign that deal and end this war? Are those, or am I missing something?
Well, yeah, I think I partially answered your question. So we're talking about what Ukraine we are ready to see as our neighbor for many years to come, for eternity, hopefully. It has to be a friendly Ukraine, not necessarily an ally, but a neutral, good-willing Ukraine. And of course, this requires respect. This demands respect not only for the rights of the people of the territory that will remain with Ukraine, not only respecting their rights to access to creature comforts, I mean food, warmth, heating, water, and so on. And of course, it's about their basic human rights, including language, education, religion. And once again, I emphasize that the Ukraine that will sign the treaty should not violate rules of international law and the constitution, the very constitution of Ukraine that guarantees rights of national minorities. And as for calls for truce, you know, people have been hysterical, saying that we inhumanly deprive Ukraine of its energy grid, depriving people of heating, and about Russia taking out Ukraine's energy grid. We were not the first to start this. Ukrainians were the first to attack heating facilities and residential areas, including hospitals. 1 year ago, a passenger train was blown up. That had nothing to do with the military. When they talk about Russia being the culprit of everything, they forget the examples, the numerous examples of our goodwill. I think last March, in March 2025, President Trump, in his telephone conversation with President Putin, suggested an energy truce for 1 month. And President Putin, on that same day, publicly upheld this initiative. For 1 month, we didn't, it was in March and April, I think, we didn't touch Ukraine's energy infrastructure at all. Over the same period, Zelensky, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was more than 130 times that Ukraine attacked our energy infrastructure, completely civilian facilities. You see, our conscience is clear, and our patience, well, is not limitless. You know Russian character, probably. We really took a long time to make our conclusions. And one of those conclusions, I'd like to talk about Alaska. I don't know what our delegation in Abu Dhabi will be offered. I had a conversation with them yesterday regarding this idea of security guarantees that Mark Rutte talked about yesterday in the Rada in Kiev. They learned that from Financial Times, I think. And if this is what the Ukrainians went to Abu Dhabi with, well, I think this is just another reason to believe that Zelensky needs no peace, that any peace will mean an end to his political career, probably not only his political career. Well, let's see what they come back with, but after talking with Rutte, Zelensky said he's willing to take compromises, but Russia also has to be willing to make compromises. And this is, well, blatant statement, I think. But I think conscience and Zelensky don't go together well. And he thinks about nothing, I think, except his own survival. And to ensure that, he needs to, well, to play some sketches on the international scene, which he sees as a theater stage, obviously. Before Alaska, Steve Witkoff had come to Russia 10 days before, I think, and he came with specific points, specific suggestions and propositions with elements of compromise. And President Putin talked about that openly, so I'm opening no secrets here. And those propositions failed to take into account a whole number of things that were essential to Russia. And we considered them, we took them into consideration, and when we came to Anchorage and when two presidents sat down with their teams, we said that this hadn't been an easy move for us, but we're willing. We conceded to certain initiatives from the U.S. We took compromises. We basically accepted their propositions. And then we waited for a long time for our American counterparts to announce that, yes, the agreement has been made, we have this and this and this. Because largely, their decision, Trump administration's decision, would have been enough for us. We didn't care much for what Europe would have to say. We didn't care much for what Ukraine would have to say. Because without the United States, Ukraine, just as Europe, without the United States, without the armaments that the U.S. sells to Europe, without reconnaissance data, without satellite data, Ukraine or Europe wouldn't have been able to fight. I'm sure after Anchorage, it wouldn't have taken long to formalize the peace agreements. But we supported the United States propositions, and Europe immediately rushed to Washington to tweak and adjust the initiative that had already been approved by President Putin. And they're still tampering with it. They're still trying to tweak it. And when American counterparts come to us, well, it feels that Europe wants more concessions on our side. Well, I gave you plenty of examples of Russia being flexible. In 2004, 2014, 2015, 2024, 2022. And honestly, President has said that many times. President Putin said that we are willing to see a diplomatic solution to that. We have never changed our terms, unlike many other participants of this political process. They have been, well, moving the gate, moving the goalpost many times. We have had a very consistent and understandable position.
Do you give the Trump administration credit for the dialogue that he's established with Russia, as imperfect as it may be? The fact is the previous administration didn't talk to you at all, didn't want to talk to you, and seemed to want to just continue the war. The Trump administration has established a dialogue. While we may be at a different place, Mr. Witkoff said in Davos that we were just very, very close to having a deal with Russia and Ukraine. It sounds like that is not the case. But you're talking at least. For example, the START treaty seems to be expiring soon, by tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah. And will America and Russia come together and renew that deal? How important is that? Do you feel confident that you can bridge that conversation with the American team?
Well, of course, the Trump administration is something absolutely different in their world outlook, in their understanding of the U.S. national interests, in their attitude towards other countries, to their allies, to their competitors, to their rivals. They are absolutely different. And the fact that this administration is willing to talk to everyone, something they have been showing since day one, since their very first day in the White House, including contacts with Russia. And those contacts go on in most different formats. And I remember very well, just recently I had the opportunity to speak on this matter. I remember very well the meeting in February 2025, 1 month after President Trump's inauguration. We, myself and Marco Rubio, had a meeting. We were joined by Mark Waltz, then National Security Advisor and now a UN representative. I was with my colleague Yuri Ushakov, and Rubio said back then that the American administration will be guided by the national interests of America, and we recognize and acknowledge that Russia has its national interests too, and then it's all down to common sense. And that should mean that we are not necessarily going to have coinciding interests. But when our interests do coincide, it will be a gross mistake not to use this alignment and to put it into practical, mutually beneficial projects in energy, space exploration, high-tech, and all sorts of stuff. And when those interests diverge, which is going to happen much more often, in fact, then we shouldn't. This difference should not evolve into confrontation, especially a hot confrontation. And I said that this is absolutely in line with our approach. On the base of this mutually respectful approach, we are willing and ready to build all sorts of cooperation. And the same point was many times emphasized by American delegations that met with President Putin, that had come before Alaska. If we take the key points, the key terms that will allow all these shining perspectives to come true, there was just one point. They said we inherited Ukraine from Biden, basically, who was absolutely anti-Russian in his stance. So Ukraine popped up on the foreground on the international agenda, and this has to be settled, and we will do that, they said. And at the same time, they understood our position. And once we're done with Ukraine, then there will be lots of mutually beneficial stuff going on for the well-being of our two nations, here and there. In this connection, I have one remark to make in this connection. In Anchorage, we accepted what the Trump administration suggested on Ukraine, and frankly speaking, this should have meant that we put Ukraine aside, that we solved it, essentially, that we took it off the table, off our shiny road towards cooperation and prosperity. But Ukraine is still there, the issue is still there on the table. It gets new dimensions that look more and more like new covenants and demands to Russia. But still, the conversation is going on, And once we're done with it, we are assured by America things will go better than they have ever been. Well, dreaming is good, and we're good at dreaming. We did plenty of dreaming under the Communist Party, but what we look at now are specific accomplishments. And you mentioned sanctions. Well, sanctions are still there, they remain, and in April 2025, soon after we had established contacts with the Trump administration, the sanctions were extended for another year. They extended for another year a bill on international situation. The bill was taken by the Biden administration, I think, and it says that there is a paragraph in it that says that Russian gold assets, gold reserves must still remain seized, as it says, in accordance with Russia's aggressive international policy. And the current administration has taken no action to change it in any way or to explain the current situation, the circumstances that have changed in our relationship. And the current understanding is obviously different from what Biden had. But what's interesting is that this bill that requires Russia's asset to remain frozen, among the reasons of such enmity, it says intervention in the presidential elections in the United States. So what Biden, Obama, and their teams were blaming Trump for, why Trump was elected in the first term. It seems that, well, it turns out that the Trump administration kind of endorses that and supports that, maybe silently, with a statement that Russia tampered with the presidential elections in the States, something that Trump has been publicly denying since day one. The sanctions, they all remain in place, they're all the same. Moreover, for the first time in a while, new sanctions were introduced, very harsh, against our biggest oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft. And that happened just a couple weeks after the Anchorage meeting.
How does that make you feel?
Well, the President Putin, was quite surprised. He said that in an interview in Anchorage, Russia supported the propositions of the United States regarding the overall settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, and after that we expected the United States to confirm this. Now that Russia agrees with our proposition, let's announce something. Let's probably gather a conference, let's sign documents, the Board of Peace, and so on. Next thing we know, we see sanctions imposed against Rosneft and Lukoil, and now tariffs are being imposed against countries that buy energy from Russia.
Two faces of Trump. It's like good Trump, bad Trump, right? At least with Biden, you only had bad Biden, but with Trump, you get... That's hard to figure out, I bet.
And right now, following the developments in Venezuela, our companies are blatantly being pushed out of Venezuela. India is being banned from buying Russian oil. Well, basically everybody is banned from buying Russian oil and gas. Everybody is talking about Russian oil and gas being exchanged with American oil and gas. And recently they passed a document on Cuba that will be probably interesting to you personally. And that document said that the document talks about some threat that Cuba is posing for the interests of the United States in the Caribbean, including the malicious policy of Russia. That kind of doesn't go very well with our investment
Do you think
cooperation.
that's Trump, or is that the administrative state and the neocons and the people who are very aggressive and anti-Russian because they make money off of wars and aggression? Those are the people controlling that, do you think? Or do you think it's Trump?
Well, I don't know. These are the domestic affairs of the United States. But we know very well, we understand very well that however powerful America is, with all its might and ambitions, America has to listen. I mean, the Trump administration has to listen to a whole number of, groups of people in their domestic and international policy. Domestically, most of all Democrats, of course, and some Republicans, of course, they are highly Russophobic. They are highly anti-Russian. And we understand that the Trump administration cannot just ignore them, cannot just ignore those factors. And to preserve the loyalty of this anti-Russian wing, they have to make some anti-Russian moves. But the essence of those anti-Russian moves is, very serious. And I can understand that the administration also has sometimes have to throw a bone to Europe as well. And what's most important to them is that Europe continues to obey Washington and continues to buy what Washington tells it to buy. I mean, weapons, LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is several times more expensive than Russian gas. I think in this situation, a certain degree of Russophobia is seen as, basically payment for. But I don't know if the national security strategy, probably yes, the national security strategy sets this as a goal to ensure dominance, America's dominance in the world economy, including the energy sphere.
Sounds like, and I'm glad to hear you say, you sound like you're optimistic. It sounds to me like you believe there is still the potential for a positive outcome, despite all the difficulties that we have just talked about and you've explained. There's one other area I want to ask you about, and that's Iran. It's in the news these days, and it's looking like Mr. Trump is pulling back from his aggressive stance and the talk of the Armada. And I'm reading reports that your government, the Russian Federation, maybe yourselves and Mr. Putin yourselves, may have been involved in some indirect or direct way in mediating that. That part of the reason things seem to be cooling a little bit or getting a little less tense is because maybe Russia was involved in helping the conversation between Iran and the Trump administration. What role have you played, if any?
We played the decisive role, I think. Everybody contributed to it a lot back in 2015, when many years of coordination of a program of actions regarding Iran's nuclear program, which specified the ceilings for low-enriched uranium that Iran was allowed to have. And everything on top of that Russia would take. And then 3 years later, President Trump, in his first term, pulled out of that deal. And this was when accusations started falling on Iran. Iran had not violated anything. But when the U.S. pulled out of that deal, and took all the advantages, all the positive sides out of that deal that Iran was interested in. Of course, Iran found itself in a situation when it had no more obligations, essentially, because the obligations were collective and they had been disrupted. But Iran continued enriching uranium. At the same time, it didn't violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It did everything under IAEA control. But still, its facilities were attacked in 12 days of bombing, American and Israeli bombings. And Director General of IAEA, Mr. Grossi, looks, well, his position looks weird in this regard, because facilities bombed by Israel and the U.S., they are under IAEA control, and IAEA was obliged to make a statement, to make a political evaluation of what was happening, because those were facilities under its control, and they were unlawfully bombed. They didn't say anything at all. And I think this only goes to show the current situation in IAEA leadership at the moment. Right now, we are not forcing ourselves as middlemen to Israel or Iran or the United States. In our contacts with them, we just discuss this situation. Iran is our partner, close partner and neighbor, and of course we care about how things develop now. Especially this situation is potentially explosive, not only for Iran itself, but for the entire Middle East. There are too many mines waiting to go off, just waiting for someone to tread on them. And I think Israel and America and Iran knows that we are ready to contribute to solving the situation and to observing the agreements previously achieved. This situation is going to be resolved. Iran's stocks of enriched uranium, Iran's inventory, we are ready to offer our services. Now, the most important thing is for all the parties to reach.
Mr. Minister, services in helping to make sure the Iranians agree to a new nuclear deal and the Americans agree to stop punishing the Iranian economy with these sanctions. Is that the deal?
Well, this is up to Iran and the United States. I hope nobody stands in their way. And if within that deal any specific steps arise in which Russia can be helpful, including our experience with storing uranium, we will be ready to contribute to that. All the parties in that know very well what Russia is willing to offer. I think Iran has once again demonstrated commitment to dialogue and willing to have a dialogue aimed at balancing the interests of all parties, and we are interested in that.
Specifics about what you spoke about. You are in conversations with the Iranian government.
Yes, we are, and our presidents talked over the phone recently, and we have contacts on the expert level.
You, sir, are so kind and so gracious to give us so much of your time.